Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives.
Next up, we have Wyly Gray. He'll be talking on changing the mental health paradigm regarding trauma, plant medicine, and veteran suicide. Wyly is a United States Marine and the leading voice supporting guided psychedelic group therapy for veterans. As founding director of Veterans of War, Wyly is deeply committed to changing the mental health paradigm regarding trauma, plant medicine, and veteran suicide. Wyly has survived a broken family, foster care, 2 deployments in support of the War on Terror, and post-traumatic stress. Through his work with Veterans of War, he experienced firsthand the strength of guided psychedelic therapy in battles against treatment-resistant trauma, depression, anxiety, insomnia, and PTS. Thanks to plant medicines, Wyly overcame suicidal thoughts and ideations, found sleep again, and cemented his purpose to bring safe and effective tools for recovery out of the shadows to serve those suffering from the treatment-resistant after effects of war. Wyly, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to Psyched.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Am I on? Hi,
Yep,
guys.
you're good.
Perfect. All right. Well, before we get started, what an incredible time to be alive. There is so much going on, and I feel as though psychedelics have never been more important than they are right now. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're having a second psychedelic renaissance as the world seems to burn around us. We've never more needed empathy, connectivity, and shared experience. So let's get started. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I want to give a quick shout out to the Psyched 2020 team for putting this conference together. I also want to thank Rick Doblin from MAPS, who famously said, "Psychedelics are not a substitute for faith. They're a door to authentic faith, born of encountering directly the sacred dimension of everyday experience." Without his contributions to the psychedelic movement over the last 35 years, Veterans of War would not be possible. I'd also like to give a quick shout out to Jesse Gould of Heroic Hearts Project and Amber and Marcus Capone from VETS. These organizations have laid the groundwork for mental health care solutions in the veteran community. Their work has paved the way for the group psychedelic assisted psychotherapy model that we use at Veterans of War. And early on, when I was crafting what Veterans of War would look like, they were integral to my success. As a quick aside, if you haven't had a chance to see London Reel's recently released documentary called Reconnect on YouTube, I highly encourage it. It's the only documentary regarding ayahuasca that I've seen that accurately depicts the interactive, difficult nature of the work needed for proper long-term integration. With that taken care of, welcome to Changing the Mental Health Paradigm regarding trauma, plant medicine, and veteran suicide. As you heard, my name is Wyly Gray. I am a Marine veteran and the founding director of Veterans of War. Veterans of War is a 501c3 nonprofit that connects teams of veterans to guided psychedelic group therapy fellowships designed to heal the scars of war. So, as a quick premise, I'd like to start with, before we go too much further, is yes, I realize I'm a veteran. What I'm talking about seems to be, at least on the surface, veteran-centered. But what I'm actually talking about is trauma. And trauma doesn't care about your age or your race, your gender, your social class, your status, or your condition. Trauma is part of the human condition. As such, I think it's important to the entire human race that we identify safe and effective tools for overcoming trauma. So let's talk a little bit about the typical veteran journey. I initially thought I would talk about some of the veterans that I serve. For example, there's a 48-year-old Marine, a veteran of the First Gulf War whose duty it was to transport and guard battlefield casualties. He literally picked up dead bodies on a battlefield and moved them to a refrigerated box that he guarded for long periods of time. He's been carrying invisible wounds of war for more than 20 years now. I thought I could talk about a 39-year-old Marine veteran who suffered from anxiety and depression, and despite all of the right moves to try to get better, he's ended up bouncing from job to job with little joy and little connection for more than a decade. I could talk about a 42-year-old veteran that on paper seems to be doing great. He owns a business, he serves the community, but behind closed doors, he's suffering from depression, a lack of connection, and he can't even find peace in simple pleasures. The reality is that the veteran landscape is currently 18.6 million people strong. There are stories of pain and hardship, grit and resilience to be found under every rock if only we look. And because I'm not a subject matter expert on any of the fine people that I've just talked to you about, what we're going to do today is take a look at the journey of healing that I've undertaken to date, both on and off the grid, to try to find relief from post-traumatic stress disorder since 2009. By the end, what I hope we find is that you're able to see some of the flaws that are inherent to our current mental health care system, and that we can agree that psychedelics offer a unique path towards effective recovery. So let's start by defining some terms. What is PTSD? Broadly, PTSD is a mental illness that affects individuals that are exposed to trauma. It typically is characterized by hyperarousal, intrusive thoughts, avoidance of trauma-related cues, negative cognition and mood, memory problems, and more. For me, it manifested as insomnia, nightmares, severe anxiety, violent outbursts, rage, and even suicidal ideations. At the worst of it, I truly believed that I was poisoning my family. Current research seems to indicate that these changes in mood are a result of actual physical changes in the brain itself. Functioning MRI studies have shown that individuals with PTSD have an exaggerated amygdala response to emotional stimuli, especially when compared to controls. To put that in layman's terms, our fight or flight response seems to be always triggered. So what does that mean? That means that it may not be possible to talk your way out of your crazy. You can't just mindfully change how you feel by focusing on something else, because the neural pathways that are in your brain are designed in such a way that they're going to take you down these predetermined paths that your brain has established. The brain is simply processing different information differently. The centers for memory retrieval, storage, and emotion are hyperaroused. This is a distinct physical change, a biomarker that must be understood if we want to combat this disease effectively and change the mental health paradigm overall. So, before we can change the paradigm, we have to identify its tenets. How have we as modern society dealt with mental health care? And specifically for this specific question, how have we dealt with veteran mental health care? The VA response can be broadly labeled as trauma-focused psychotherapy coupled with lifelong medications such as SSRIs or sleep aids. Trauma-focused psychotherapy means therapy that involves multiple talk therapy sessions, typically between 8 and 16, where veterans are visualizing, talking, and thinking about traumatic memories in an effort to change unhelpful belief patterns. The typical therapies offered include prolonged exposure, which is when you face your negative feelings directly, cognitive processing therapy or CPT, which is when you reframe your negative thoughts actively, and then finally eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, where the participant will replay trauma again and again while focusing on a repetitive sound or trigger, trying to lessen the severity of their expression with each iteration. So, in layman's terms, veterans are asked to relive their most painful traumatic memories again and again and again until, like rubbing a wound, until you can't feel the sting, we're supposed to have somehow dealt with it. While this does show promise for some veterans, as you can imagine, for other veterans, it's incredibly triggering and can exacerbate some of the functions. The only other option that's presented to us, and it's typically already in tandem with the other options that I presented, is medication. The VA actively touts the efficacy of Zoloft, Paxil, Prozac, and Effexor for the treatment of PTSD. These are the same medications that civilians would take for the very same indications. They're supposed to be taken daily until there is no need. They typically take about 2 months of daily intake before they reach full effect, and dosage changes depending on the individual. So finding the right chemistry and the right doctor is incredibly important. The problem with this method, at least topically, is because there's a chemical and a physical change in your brain, what you tend to do now, instead of actually changing the relationship to that trauma or healing the trauma itself, is put a Band-Aid on each of these different manifestations of trauma. What happens if the Band-Aid is dangerous too? The first real side effect for many of the SSRIs that I've named is, and I quote, SSRIs have been shown to increase the risk of suicidal thoughts and behavior in patients when used to treat major depressive disorders or other psychiatric disorders. So veterans who are potentially suicidal already are being given medicine that may in fact reinforce their negative predisposition. That seems incredible, but that's the truth of the paradigm for mental health care for veterans as it stands today. And I'll remind you that that clock is ticking in the United States to the tune of 120 people, Americans, lost to suicide every day. And of that 120, 20 of which are veterans. We're highly overrepresented. And all of which are being prescribed, for the most part, these antidepressants. So the model seems to be talk therapy coupled with a medication that is given whack-a-mole style in order to suppress the presentation of symptoms. And this is continued in perpetuity. As soon as you stop taking your medication, your symptoms will present again. So what we're really offering people is the cessation of symptomology, but literally nothing in terms of how do I reconnect and overcome this trauma. Every person that suffers from PTSD can probably tell you the moment that they knew they had a problem. I'm no different. I remember I was 2 years out of the Marines. I was going to college and I had just come home from class. And for whatever reason, all day long during class, I was craving a banana. And I had a bunch of them on the table. I was literally again and again just thinking about, I can't wait till I walk in my apartment door and I can grab a banana. I'm so hungry. And my brother, my little brother who lived with me at the time, when I walked in, he had eaten all of them already. And I remember taking the big wooden bowl that I carried, that we would have all the fruits in on the table. I picked it up and I slammed it against the wall, shattering the mirror there. And I remember looking back at my broken reflection. I had that like Michael Jackson man in the mirror moment where I saw myself and I didn't like my reflection, well, literally and figuratively. I turned around that moment and I left directly to the VA. And I remember when I arrived, I simply said, I have a problem. I can't control my anger. I don't know if I'm going to be a threat to myself or others. I just can't control myself. Over the next couple of years, I tried their programs. I took their medication. While on them, I didn't feel suicidal or angry. In fact, I didn't feel much of anything. I felt a lot like a zombie. One of my eyes was dilated on one of the medications that I took, but not the other. So I was constantly squinting, and my brain wasn't sharp, which was incredibly important because I was in college. When I complained and I asked about if there were any other options, I was told that my symptoms were literally the new me, that I should find ways to cope because none of this will get any better unmedicated. But the problem was that the better that they offered wasn't much of a life, even with the medication. So I simply didn't accept the answer. I began studying in earnest the brain, what had happened to mine, and I looked for answers on how I could repair it, if that was even possible. Thanks to Dr. Rick Strassman's work in DMT, the spirit molecule, I found hope again. It would take me years of further study and continuing dark experiences to finally push me over the edge to seek out plant medicine deep in the jungles of Peru. But it's ridiculous that I even had to do that, that I had to go on such a dangerous trip by myself in a foreign country where I didn't speak the language to get access to a medicine that there wasn't a lot of information about. It took me more than a decade of suffering just to overcome my fear and take that leap. I'm forever grateful that I did, because I wouldn't be here today without it. But that it's 2020 and these safe and effective solutions for overcoming trauma have been on the planet, living with us for millennia, and we're talking about them now as though they're somehow novel approaches or new, only reflects our lack of study and not their efficacy or their continued persistence in our culture. So what did I end up finding? I found a path towards healing that's paved in hard work, that's highlighted by the intense connection I was reminded we all share in ayahuasca. Ayahuasca for me, which if you're unfamiliar, is simply a psychedelic tea master plant teacher from the Amazon rainforest. Finding ayahuasca was the beginning of a new mental health paradigm. One centered not on take a pill and call me in the morning, but instead focused on a shared experience. What the plant showed me what was possible and my work that would be necessary to make those visions a reality. And this is a part of the story that I feel like seems to get glossed over more often than not. The medicine and access to it in whatever form it comes in, those are incredibly important parts of this. But equally important is the integration work that is expected for you to be successful afterwards. One of the first things that I realized was that so many of the manifestations of trauma that I was dealing with, whether it was the insomnia, the hypervigilance, hyperarousal, or the suicidal thoughts and ideations, they were all tied to my experiences. In some ways, they were my body's way of trying to protect me. For example, the hypervigilance was trying to keep me safe. And I had forged neural pathways that basically translated to, if this specific stimulus occurs, this is the correct response to maintain your safety and the safety of those people around you. But what had happened over the long term was that those fight or flight responses, boiled down, had taken over my active personality. But once you see that those paths have done that, you can identify alternative ways to mitigate them consciously. And that's what ayahuasca provided me, was a way to see some of the ways that I had been coping with my trauma in a direct relation to how could I change these and have my trauma serve me instead of my trauma being a burden for me. So once you see the paths and you identify the way to make it better, then comes the real work. Then comes the hard integrative work of using those paths constantly, forging them again and again in your mind, walking through them again and again so that they become your new neural normal. So this new model for mental health care is different because it's both interactive as well as dependent on hard work. We're not just giving somebody something and walking away. We understand that there is a complex relationship being formed between the medicine and the participant. And only through the participant's continued work will the highest benefits of the medicine be reached. In this new model, we're trying something very, very important, and that is simply to treat the trauma itself. Rather than play whack-a-mole and you know, if somebody has insomnia, let's give them sleep aids. If somebody has anxiety, let's prescribe them SSRIs. If somebody has trouble with a particular memory, let's talk it out. Why don't we treat the source of the trauma itself? Why don't we use psychedelics as a diagnostic and analytic tool and help people long-term through the hard work of support and integration that would be necessary for this to be effective? The benefits of approaching mental health care with guided psychedelics are already being classified as breakthrough therapies in their own right. But in order to ensure long-term positive outcomes, so that this isn't a fire in the night scenario, I think that there needs to be a determined focus on aftercare and integration support. I believe that the future of mental health care will welcome a bold shift towards accepting psychedelics globally, where we treat the many sources of trauma instead of their symptoms. That future is possible if we as a community embrace guided therapy as a viable tool, guided psychedelic therapy as a viable tool to overcome trauma and meaningfully comfort those that continue to suffer. It's time to start the hard work of creating an accepted therapeutic framework for healing using psychedelics instead of continuing to line the pockets of pharmaceutical companies who are only invested in the perpetual suppression of symptoms. When I came back from the jungle, I asked myself, what do I wish was here so I could maximize the potential of this therapy for others? Veterans of War's framework for mental health care answers that question. So what we've designed at Veterans of War is a program that sits on 4 pillars, and those pillars are education, preparation, integration, and support. It's not an easy process, and it's not one that we believe you should do alone. So the fellowship, it's designed as a fellowship, meaning that it's a 6-month guided curriculum, and it's a team-based fellowship, meaning that a group of veterans works together from start to finish, both with the curriculum and also with a certified integration coach whose job it is to ensure that they understand what they're getting into and how to best plot a path towards meaningful recovery. So what does it look like? It's broken down into 3 phases. The first phase, the team of 4 veterans, which we affectionately call Fire Team, begins 2 months of guided group therapy with a certified integration coach conducted via Zoom with bi-weekly calls designed simply to support the first 2 pillars, education and preparation. Phase 2, the Fire Team, the coach and staff meet at our workshop location in Peru for a 12-day intensive guided ayahuasca workshop with 4 opportunities to drink spread out over the period, staggered with days for coaching, debriefing, lessons learned, guided meditation and yoga, a holistic response. And finally, phase 3, Fire Teams return to their homes of record and begin the final phase of the curriculum based on integration and support. This phase is double the length. It's 4 months, whereas the entirety of the fellowship up to this point is only 2 months, as the first guided group therapy module, with bi-weekly guided group therapy built into every call. Peer-to-peer support is integral to the success of the fellowship program. Upon completion of the fellowship, participants are paired with peer mentors in perpetuity to ensure long-term support, and then they are added to our fellow pool. And the idea there is to help incentivize and funnel continued involvement in future fellowships in the peer or mentor capacity. Veterans of War believes that healing happens in community, and success in one of our fellowships is a direct result of connection through shared experience, long-term peer-to-peer support, accountability, and again, I can't stress enough, hard work. I truly believe, and I've seen in our community, that guided psychedelic group therapy is an incredibly safe and effective path towards meaningful recovery. And as humans, being tribal by nature, working together as a team will only reinforce that belief. With that being said, I'd like to thank you for your time and your attention. If we work together, we can change the discussion regarding psychedelics. We can change the outcomes of those that continue to suffer, and what we can accept from mental health care. And before I open it up to questions, I just want to give you a quick quote from Terence McKenna that I really appreciate. "There is a light at the end of the tunnel. The problem is that the tunnel is in the back of your mind. And if you don't go to the back side of your mind, you'll never see the light at the end of the tunnel. Once you see it, the task becomes to empower it in yourself and other people. Spread it as a reality. God did not retire to the 7th heaven. God is some kind of lost continent in the human mind." Thank you so much for your time, and we'll open up to questions now.
Hey, Wiley, thank you so much for the talk. Really appreciated it. Really a beautiful message. I'd love to just dive into get a better sense of how do folks who are getting trained for any sort of armed services, what does the conversation around things like PTSD that might occur in the later stages look like before you even go to combat? Does that conversation even happen? And yeah, what does it look like if it
It's a
does?
great question that I've never ever been asked before. So you're the first for that. Honestly, when I was coming up, there was no active war. I was in from June of 2000 until December of 2008. So before September 11th, and then a couple deployments in support of the wars on terror. Um, the people that I knew prior to enlisting that would have had any relevant sort of idea into what you're speaking about specifically would have been the Vietnam generation. And those guys were, as a group, due to the hostility that they faced when they came back, typically fairly close-lipped about it. And while I could understand that the experiences that they had were incredibly formative for most of them, because the way that the war was sold to them and their own involvement in it, they had this sense of moral outrage, coupled with, of course, all the trauma that would come with being actively involved in a war. And that talk really never happened. I'm curious for a younger veteran or a younger service member who would probably have a better answer to this. Is that something that people talk about nowadays? Or I guess a better question is, if my daughter were to try to join, would I talk to her about PTSD and what could happen? I think the answer is yes. I think that it's incredibly important. When I was 18, I was naive. And when I joined for an ideal that I thought I was supporting, protecting, and defending the ideals of the Constitution and the values of my community. The reality on the ground was very, very different. And I never had a talk prior to being deployed that would have prepared me for that. It's hard to know what you don't know. You know what I mean? Like, it's easy to say, I don't know, but you don't really know what you don't know until you're there. A better way to say that, I guess, would be anyone can tell you the weight of a rifle, but you won't know the conscious weight of that rifle till you've carried it. And I don't mean a physical sense. I mean the metaphysical sense. What does that rifle weigh?
Definitely. Yeah, earlier on today we had Keith Abraham, who's running Heroic Hearts
Amazing.
UK. Yeah, and would really, one of the questions that we talked about was basically kind of this idea that after you take psychedelics, it's very difficult to be redeployed, to get to a point where you're probably going to even consider going back into combat because you have such an awakening of unification and oneness. Would you agree with that sentiment, or do you think that psychedelics can both heal an individual but still allow for them to be prepared for their next deployment into combat again?
Well, the psychedelic journey is distinct for every person. So you're asking me to paint with a very broad brush. But what I can do here is give you two separate sentiments. The first is when I was in Afghanistan, one of the things that I remember feeling, there was a specific point where the kill count for our battery that I was supporting as the ammunition chief of an artillery battery, where the kill count for our unit was higher than the amount of Marines in our unit. And up until that point, for whatever reason, I could cognitively, I had that dissonance where I could say, I'm only logistics, like I'm not killing anybody here. Despite the fact that every single one of the bullets that went downrange went through my hands first, I still, for whatever reason, felt like I'm not really doing anything. Well, when that number overcame the amount of people in our battery, it was the tipping point. And I was like, oh man, like I'm totally involved. And that was the moment I remember thinking, like, one of a couple times where I'm not here to kill people. I'm not on this planet to take life. That is fundamentally, I just understood it. Even having already been I was a staff sergeant, having served for 8.5 years actively. I thought I was a lifer before an experience like that. But after realizing, the weight of my rifle, so to speak, I was very much of the impression, like, I'm not to do this. How does that couple with somebody having an intense psychedelic experience? Well, one of the first things that a lot of people will say that have done psychedelics is it enhances or allows you to understand the connectivity that people share. If you truly believe, as I do, that we're all like branches of the same tree, you'll think twice before pruning another branch, because that's you. It's part of you. That's my personal answer to that. And I don't know if that answered it for you, but it's as well as I can do.
No, definitely, definitely. And I think that that's such a important question for us to be asking, especially over these next 10 years, and with the government gaining more interest in terms of, using these compounds, and also just this greater, show and display that these compounds really can heal, especially our veteran population. How are they used, and how do people interact? What insights do they gain going forward? So yeah. But Wyly, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate your story and your insights, and really looking forward to chatting more soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. When you guys leave today, go out and just be good to each other. Love yourselves and be good to each other.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Wyly. Be
Thank
well.
you.